Culture is a rich and exciting aspect of organization studies. Those interested in these parts of organizational communication have a lot to teach us about the workplace, so why don't we dive right in? Like many things in our studies together, culture can be approached from two different perspectives. First, we might ask, how does culture affect an organization and the people working there? This is an external approach to organizational culture, and one that we'll look at in this lecture. A second approach asks, what is the culture of this organization? And that can be thought of as an internal approach. Both views give us a great deal of insight into the communication and behaviors of leaders and members of organizations. So let's start with a look at the external view of culture. Externally, we can examine culture in a couple of different ways as well. First, we might say that your culture is part of what Wilbur Schramm called an individual's field of experience. Schramm developed this concept in 1955 in his process and effects model of communication. In this model, Schramm argues that everyone approaches a communication situation with a given set of experiences in his or her life up until that point. So if we were to draw this, we would say that the individual has what we call his or her field of experience. That individual, with this field of experience and all of this stuff that comes with them, approaches and communicates with another individual who also has his or her own field of experience. The point from Schramm's perspective is that people are trying to communicate in this space, and the more we communicate with one another, the more this overlap can expand. Culture is one of the parts of our field of experience. The individuals communicating might initially, therefore, approach one another with very little in common, but over time and through continued feedback with one another, we develop the ability to understand one another better. I especially like Schramm's model because it refers to the Latin root of communication, communicatio, to share, or, interestingly, communion. From this perspective, attributes of the individual and his or her culture, such as nationality, gender, sexuality, all impact our work. Edgar Schein additionally discusses the occupational cultures to which different professional types might adhere or subscribe. He suggests in an interview from Forbes magazine that corporate culture is no longer the relevant topic. I think, says Schein, the topic is macro culture, nations, corporations, and corporate culture, where these nationalities and occupations play out. So we have to take a corporate culture at a much more general level and look at both occupational cultures and national cultures and how they play out in corporate cultures. There are many resources in the popular literature about cross-cultural business communication. One example is Peterson's book, Cultural Intelligence, a guide to working with people from other cultures, in which the author suggests that knowledge of other cultures with whom we interact through our work is important for good business relationships and positive outcomes. In other words, we can't just approach potential customers from other cultures with our assumptions about communication, because that's not going to work. These kinds of books explain to people how to work with people from other cultures and how to do business better in an intercultural context. Books like Peterson's and the many others like it are primarily interested in this very important concept of intercultural communication sensitivity. That is, how people in countries outside of the US might behave differently than we do, and what your expectations should be if you're an international traveler, and how to be appropriate with folks in other countries. These workshops and advice books treat culture as external in that it affects how communication works in the workplace and how we do communicate at work. A second way to approach culture as an external variable is outlined by Go-Wai John in the Management Communication Quarterly article that you'll be reading for this unit. Culture, from John's perspective, is seen as external, but it's more dynamic than the way that we've described it previously. John's argument centers on national cultures and the degree to which workers adjust when working outside of their own home cultures. If an employee retains a great deal of values and adheres to his or her own home culture, according to John, and adjusts well also to a new culture, this person is said to be integrating the two. In John's chart, you'd be in the top right-hand corner. Here's a good example. In past years at Juniata College, I've invited international students to my house for Thanksgiving. American Thanksgiving is a very American holiday, and an international student would not have experienced this unless they are here in November. A few years ago, one of those students came to my Thanksgiving celebration. She asked lots of questions, she shared about national holidays in Morocco, and she made some Moroccan food for us that would go with our turkey and mashed potatoes. That's an example of a student who's very much integrated. She's very interested in sharing her own culture and learning about the new culture where she's studying. An assimilator would be someone who's in the bottom right-hand corner of this chart. And this person might come to my Thanksgiving celebration and make no connection to their own culture. This person retains very little of their own cultural customs, and they just sort of become American very easily. A good example of an assimilator would be my grandfather. He immigrated to the United States in the 1920s from Italy. When he got to the US, he never spoke Italian again. He fully assimilated. He was very high on adjustment to his new culture and low on adherence to his old culture. A student, or for our consideration, an employee who separates, adheres to their own culture and does not embrace the new culture. This would be the person who steadfastly rejects my Thanksgiving invitation, or the employee who continues to do things the way they do it at home, rather than adjusting to the way their new company does it. Although John's article is primarily concerned with international cultural values and expectations, I think these can also be seen regionally or organizationally. This occurs when people want to institute their values of their old jobs into the cultures of their new jobs. For instance, when I came to Juniata, I wanted things to work in many ways the way they worked at Rutgers University. But that's not the way it works at Juniata, and so I had to adjust. If I didn't adjust, I would have definitely been a separator, and I probably would not have been successful at Juniata. Finally on John's chart is someone who's low on both adjusting and adhering. This person can't adjust to a new culture, but they feel separated, and they no longer feel connected to their home culture. This is a person who John would call alienated. Obviously, you would see from John's article that this would be someone who would struggle quite a bit in their new job and in their new culture. So far we've discussed two basic ways that different scholars and people who are interested in organizational communication and culture view culture as an external variable. We've seen Peterson's external variable approach and John's external process model. Next, we're going to consider two approaches to the culture inside of the organization. And as you might guess, there is a variable approach, which Dennis Mumby calls the pragmatist approach, and there's a process approach, which Mumby calls the purist approach. Mumby proposes that the pragmatist approach is very managerialist. That is, culture is a thing that an organization possesses, that managers can use, understand, manage, and change an organization's culture. From this perspective, the organization's culture is managed from the top down, and communication is seen as a tool for managing that culture. This is by far the most popular way of thinking about organizational culture in the popular management literature. It differs quite a bit from the more academically oriented purist approach or process approach, in which culture is seen as a metaphor. From this perspective, a purist would argue that an organization is a culture, that it does not have a culture, and communication is the thing that constructs or constitutes that culture. This purist approach to culture would be quite easily in line with a CCO approach to organizations as we studied from Francois Couron and his colleagues. The view of culture from this perspective is that organizations have many competing subcultures and that it is oriented from the bottom up rather than the top down. That is, it's the workers who establish and maintain the corporate culture by the way that they organize and work in everyday life. Those are very different ways to look at what an organizational culture is. What they share that's different from the external approach is that they're both concerned with what culture is like on the inside of the organization. That is, what the organizational members share and have built within the organizational boundaries. As we wrap up, let's look at a few definitions of organizational culture from around the academic and popular literature. Edgar Schein says, culture is a pattern of basic shared assumptions that was learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. Angela Trethewey claims culture is the sum of symbols, events, traditions, standardized verbal and nonverbal behavior patterns, folktales, and rituals that give the organization a personality. Both of these authors talk about culture in similar and also different ways. You'll be reading both of those authors for this unit, the first 4 chapters of the Schein book and 1 chapter by Trethewey from a text edited by Byers. Specifically, what I'd like you to do in the forums for this unit is to integrate some of these ideas and try to decide whether you think Schein and Trethewey take pragmatist or purist views, and what you think is the best way for a student to understand organizational culture. Basically today, we learned that culture can be looked at externally or internally. Culture from the outside sees culture as static, and it affects the workplace communication, or as process-oriented, that is, your approach to your home culture and your new culture combined have an impact on your workplace relationships. Culture from the inside can be seen from a pragmatist perspective as a thing that can be manipulated and communication as a tool that we use to change and teach the culture, or as a purist sees it, where cultures are products of communication in organizational settings and oriented more towards employees than managers. All of these approaches bring us fresh insight into the ways that cultures affect and are developed in the workplace. I hope you enjoy learning more about these processes as you continue in this unit.